The memory of that late afternoon in Bolivia followed Mariela like a quiet ghost. The sky was painted in an almost unreal shade of orange, but inside her, everything felt gray. The chairs at the little restaurant where she worked were already stacked, and she scrubbed the tables with the same force she used to try and erase the words she'd heard just hours earlier when she found out the man she'd given 5 years of her life to had another woman in secret, and that the debts he'd taken out under her name were now knocking at her door like starving creditors. It was as if his betrayal had stripped from her not only her trust, but also any sense of belonging. As she swept the floor for the last time that night, she realized there was nothing left holding her there. The world she knew had crumbled so completely that staying felt more painful than leaving. That same night, she decided to sell the little she owned. An old radio, 2 dresses, a small TV she'd inherited from her mother. When everything was gone, she had $500. Not a fortune, just a fragile rope she'd try to use to climb out of the grave. Life kept digging for her. Her farewell to the house she grew up in was quiet. She ran her hands slowly along the painted clay walls, as if she needed to record on her skin the last touch of a home that would never be the same again. Outside, the old bus that would take her to La Paz puffed out white smoke like a tired sigh. Before climbing aboard, she looked up at the window of the bedroom where her mother had spent so many nights cooking so she'd never go hungry. Even when there wasn't enough of anything, Mariela felt a tightness in her chest, imagining what her mother would say if she were still alive. Maybe she'd ask her to stay. Maybe she'd make one of those thick soups that healed even the deepest wounds. But none of that was possible. Memory was all she had left. The trip to Miami went by in a blur. The plane felt too big, too cold, too loud. Every few minutes, she touched her backpack, making sure the $500 were still tucked between hastily folded clothes, like a backup heart ready to replace her own at any moment. When she landed, the hot, humid air slapped her across the face. The city pulsed at a completely different frequency, a mix of hurry, unfamiliar languages, and impatient horns. Finding a cheap place to sleep was its own ordeal. She ended up in a shared room with 4 other women, all immigrants like her, smelling of cheap deodorant, built-up sweat, and dreams, trying to survive. The first night dragged on endlessly. She heard muffled crying, video calls with faraway families, whispered prayers. When she finally fell asleep, the thin mattress felt like it was biting into her back. The next morning, she woke before sunrise to go to the restaurant that had advertised dishwashing jobs. The manager, a Cuban man with a rough face and a calculating stare, sized her up the way someone inspects a used machine. He asked if she could stand for hours, if heat bothered her, if she could work fast. Mariela said yes to everything, even though she wasn't sure. He hired her on the spot. Her first shift was a plunge into the harsh reality nobody mentions in immigration dreams. Stacks of greasy plates, giant pots burning her hands. Shouts of, "Rapido! Rapido!" Steam stinging her eyes. She worked like she was running from something, as if moving nonstop was the only way not to think. When she got home, her hair smelling like old oil, she collapsed onto the bed without even kicking off her shoes. The days that followed turned into an exhausting routine. Hot water splashing on her face, the constant feeling of being invisible, the fear of messing up. Sometimes, while scrubbing dishes late at night, she remembered her mother cooking so calmly, turning corn, cheap chicken, and spices into a smell that filled their whole house with comfort. But in that American kitchen, surrounded by shouting and chaos, that world felt impossibly far away. Then, one night, something changed. The head cook didn't show up, and the restaurant spiraled into panic. The manager looked around for anyone who could at least keep the kitchen alive until someone else arrived. His eyes landed on Mariela, who was hanging up a wet apron to dry. "You," he said, like he was picking up a forgotten utensil. "Get in there and do what you can." She froze. Fear crawled up, her throat dry, rough. But there was something else too, something buried deep. An old memory of her mother's hands guiding hers over a wooden board, teaching her cuts, seasonings, timing. With hesitant steps, she walked into the kitchen. The space felt like another universe of bubbling pots, mixed aromas, the rhythmic clatter of knives, She took a deep breath and started working. She touched the spices like she was greeting old friends. She made a simple dish, but she poured into it a gentleness she hadn't felt in years. When the servers took the plates out to the dining room, she didn't even look. She was afraid of what people would say. Minutes later, she heard a voice outside calling for the manager. It was an older American woman asking who had cooked her food. She said the dish had the taste of a home she didn't know yet, but wished she could go back to. Mariella didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The kitchen fell silent for a moment, and in that silence, something inside her flickered back to life. It wasn't hope, not yet. But it was something close to it, something small, delicate, and stubborn. When her shift finally ended, Mariella walked slowly down a damp Miami street. The sky was dark, but inside her, a spark was glowing, something she hadn't felt in a long time. And for the first time since she left her country, that huge city didn't feel like a monster. It felt like a possible beginning. In the days after the kitchen incident, Mariella tried to go back to her routine of washing dishes. But something inside her no longer fit in that humid, noisy corner. The manager, who could barely remember her name before, started watching her differently. Not with respect, exactly, but with a kind of uneasy curiosity. Like he was trying to figure out where that unexpected skill had come from. He didn't give her praise or promises. He just yelled her name from time to time when the kitchen got slammed or a cook was running late. It was his crooked way of admitting he needed her. For Mariella, every time she touched a pot, it felt like reconnecting with a part of herself she thought she'd left behind. During breaks, when the other workers sat down to scarf down their meals, she stayed standing, testing spice combinations in some forgotten corner of the kitchen. Sometimes she made tiny portions and left them by the sink. Once, a waiter tasted a sauce she was experimenting with and let out a surprised whistle. "You've got magic hands, girl," he said, not realizing how much those words meant. The problem was that talent didn't pay rent. She still worked long hours, still shared a tiny room with other women, still had to do the math to decide whether she'd buy burn ointment or groceries for the week. The money she earned barely covered the basics, and as much as cooking gave her a moment to breathe. Reality was harsh, solid, unforgiving. One muggy August night, when the heat felt like it was melting the apartment walls, one of her roommates, a Nicaraguan woman named Frances, looked at her with a tired smile. "You cook way too well to be making $8 an hour washing dishes," she said, stirring a pot of leftover rice. "Ever thought about cooking on your own?" Mariella laughed, but it was a laugh full of embarrassment. With what money? With what time? With willpower, Frances insisted. "Everyone here eats out. People pay good money for food that tastes like home." That sentence echoed in her mind for days, low, steady, unshakable. Maybe it was foolish, maybe it was impossible. But something in her had been planted, whether she realized it or not. What set everything off came one Sunday morning, when she decided to make a Bolivian soup for her roommates to thank them for sharing rice and advice during the hardest weeks. The smell drifted through the whole apartment building, and in no time 3 neighbors knocked on the door asking if anything was for sale. She hadn't planned on selling, but the way their eyes lit up as if the aroma had tugged on some warm memory made her hesitate. She ended up serving improvised portions in plastic containers. When Tay left, she realized she'd made almost $40 without even stepping outside. That night, lying on her thin mattress, she held the money in her hands for a long time. It wasn't much, but it represented something she hadn't felt in ages. Possibility. She gathered courage and started cooking meal boxers on her days off. At first, it was 2 or 3 orders. Then 5. Then 10. Latino drivers stopped by to pick up her food because someone had recommended her, and soon they were ordering ahead of time. The tiny apartment stove worked twice as hard, and the cramped kitchen filled with pots, steam, aromas, and hope. But with that early success came pressure. The other women in the apartment started complaining about the mess, the strong smells, the noise. The building manager threatened to kick them out if the place kept being used as a restaurant. Mariella felt the bridge collapsing before it was even built. She spent sleepless nights debating whether she should quit before causing trouble for the people who had taken her in. That's when Frances came up with a solution. "My cousin has an empty garage," she said, stirring her coffee. "It's not big, but you could fit a stove and a few tables. You pay part of the rent, and that's it. A garage? Mariella asked, half laughing. No restaurant starts big, Francis replied. What matters is starting. The garage was in a simple but safe neighborhood. The space could barely hold a portable stove, a small freezer, a folding table, and a few plastic shelves. The ceiling had mold stains. The floor was rough, but when Mariella set her pots down there for the first time, a wave of emotion washed over her. As unlikely as it looked, this was her first business. She worked at the restaurant during the day, and the moment she stepped into that garage, she became someone else, more alive, more connected to herself. She made traditional Bolivian dishes, reinvented others, created her own blends of spices. Sometimes she cried from exhaustion while chopping onions. Other times she smiled to herself after reading messages from customers asking for more food than she could keep up with. One day, a young Latina influencer, well known in the local community, showed up to pick up a meal box. She'd heard about that Bolivian homemade flavor that feels like a hug. She tasted the food right there, standing in the garage doorway, and her face lit up. "What do you call this?" she asked. "Picante de palo," Mariela answered, shy. "It's incredible. You have no idea." The influencer recorded a quick video, praising the flavor and the story of this Bolivian woman cooking out of an improvised garage. She posted it on TikTok. Within hours, the video started getting likes, comments, shares. Within 2 days, it had gone viral. Mariella woke up to more than 100 messages on her phone. People wanted orders, wanted her schedule, wanted to reserve dishes she didn't even have the ingredients to make. As she read through everything, her heart beat so fast it felt like it was trying to leap out of her chest. She didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or run somewhere just to breathe. But she breathed right there, sitting on the garage floor, hands shaking and the smell of spices still clinging to her hair. She took a deep breath, the kind someone takes when they know they're about to step through a door they can never go back from. Her life was changing, and this time, it wasn't because of pain. It was because she deserved it. The viral video changed everything, but not in the glamorous way people imagine when they hear success stories. For Mariella, the beginning of this new phase was pure chaos. Her phone buzzed non-stop, like the whole world had learned her name overnight. Orders came from every corner of Miami. People wanted huge meals. Companies asked for full menus, even folks wondering if she catered events. The truth was, she barely had the structure to handle 5 orders at once, much less 50. That morning, as she tried answering messages with trembling hands, she realized her garage was far too small, her stove too weak, her freezer practically dead. Fear started to grow, the kind she felt in Bolivia or her first days in Miami. This was a different fear. Not fear of failing, but fear of not being ready to win. The first week after the video went viral was a whirlwind. She slept only a few hours a night, cooking as much as she possibly could. Neighbors who had never spoken to her stopped by asking for dishes just to try. A quiet Haitian man with kind eyes showed up offering help with deliveries for a small fee. She accepted not out of business strategy, but because she literally couldn't be in 2 places at once. But blessings brought problems, too. At the restaurant where she still washed dishes, the manager started acting strange. Sharp questions, snappy orders, suspicious looks. He knew about the video, and even though he didn't say it outright, Mariella could feel he was worried she'd quit any moment. Or worse, worried her cooking skills might outshine his professional cooks. "You remember you're under contract, right?" he said one night while stacking empty boxers. "If you miss a shift, you're out." Mariella just nodded, swallowing the knot in her throat. She needed the job, bills didn't wait, and her business still wasn't enough to live on. It was like balancing on 2 fragile bridges at once, both ready to collapse. Even exhausted, something inside her kept pushing her forward. When she entered the garage and turned on the stove, the world snapped into focus. The hot steam rose, mixed with the smell of cumin, onions, and chili peppers. That's where life made sense. That's where she felt her mother's presence more strongly than anywhere else. One particularly brutal night stayed with her forever. She'd received a big order for a small community event, about 40 meals. It was the largest order she'd ever gotten. She worked all day at the restaurant, ran home, changed clothes, and rushed to the garage. For hours she chopped vegetables, fried, seasoned, packed. By 3 in the morning, her body felt ready to collapse. The garage floor was damp with condensed steam, and the single light bulb flickered like it was tired too. When she finally sealed the last meal container, her hands throbbed with pain. She sat on the floor, rested her head on her knees, and took a deep breath, trying not to cry. The silence was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat, a tired rhythm, but a stubborn one. In that moment, she seriously considered quitting. She thought about Bolivia, about the simple life she could have had if she hadn't dared to dream so big. She thought about her ex, the one who shattered her confidence and who, without meaning to, might have saved her life by forcing her to start over. Then, something small, almost invisible, changed everything. On the table beside her was an old photograph of her mother that she always kept in her backpack. The photo slipped and fell to the floor, landing right next to her hand. Her mother's smile seemed to glow under the flickering light. Mariela picked up the picture and held it close to her chest like she needed a hug the world had refused her. "I can do this, Mama," she whispered, her voice still wet with tears. "For you, I can." The next day, the event was an absolute success. People praised her food, asked for more, and wondered if she had a restaurant. Some mothers told her that the taste of home had made their kids eat without complaining for the first time in months. An elderly woman with pure white hair held Mariela's hand and said, "You cook with soul. That can't be taught. It's something you carry." Those words filled her like warm medicine. They were different from the compliments she heard at the restaurant, different from the hype on social media. This was real recognition from people who understood what it meant to find comfort in a plate of food. With demand growing, Mariela started saving money without even noticing. Every dollar she tucked away felt like an invisible brick in a future she still didn't dare to imagine. She still worked at the restaurant, still shared a room, still worried about tomorrow, but now, tomorrow wasn't as dark. Cloudy, yes, but not dark. It was during another late night of cooking, as she stirred a huge pot of picante de palo, that Frances walked into the garage holding her phone and looking stunned. "Mari, did you see this?" she asked, breathless. "See? What?" Mariela replied, still stirring. A local journalist reposted the influencer's video. "She wants to interview you." Mariela froze. The steam rose up toward her face, but it didn't burn anymore. For a few seconds, the world went completely silent. An interview. With her, a woman with no formal training, no restaurant, cooking out of a damp garage. Her breath caught because something told her that nothing would ever be the same again. She felt panic rise in her chest, the same panic she'd felt when she arrived in the United States, with nothing but $500 hidden inside her bra. But this time something was different. She was different. She took a deep breath, fixed her hair, wiped her hands on her stained apron, and looked at Frances. "Tell her I'll do it." Right there, in that simple, quiet moment, Mariela realized she was crossing the line between someone who dreams and someone who builds. And there was no turning back. The interview happened on a bright Saturday morning, but to Mariela it felt like the sun had risen just for her, lighting up every gesture, every doubt, every fear. The journalist, an African-American woman with a warm smile and a steady voice, stepped into the garage, with curious eyes taking in everything. The pots shining, despite the wear, the improvised shelves, the tiny wooden tableware. Mariela chopped onions with almost poetic precision. "So this is where the magic happens?" the reporter asked, smiling. Mariela almost laughed. Magic. If this was magic, it was the sweaty kind built on sleepless nights and burned hands. But it was hers. The interview started shyly, with simple questions about her arrival in the U.S., her life in Bolivia, why she cooked. Mariela answered softly, choosing each word as if it might be judged. But when she talked about her mother, about the clay pots, the way she seasoned food while humming quietly, the cold nights when a hot soup was the only thing keeping their hearts alive, her voice shifted. It became fuller, steadier. The reporter noticed and smiled. "You cook with memory," she said, with history. The interview aired 2 days later. It wasn't sensational or exaggerated. It was human. It showed Mariella stirring a pot of broth with quiet tears slipping down her face. It showed the tiny garage where she turned sadness into recipes. It showed her shy smile when the reporter called her a culinary entrepreneur. The response was immediate. Within hours, followers poured into her social media. People offered donations. Others offered used equipment. Many wanted to place orders. The little garage became too small, and the neighbors' complaints grew along with the line of customers outside. Around that time, the manager at the restaurant decided to confront her. He called her into his office, a tiny cubicle that smelled like old cigarettes and fryer grease. "You've been distracted," he said without looking at her. "Your dishes are falling behind." Mariella took a breath. She knew what was coming. "I'm doing TB's primera carne. Señor, the best isn't enough." He shot back. "If this continues, I'll have to replace you." She swallowed hard. Inside, she felt a mix of fear and indignation. Yes, she was tired. Yes, sometimes she arrived a few minutes late. Yes, her body couldn't always keep up with the brutal pace of the job. But she also knew that if she was fired, she'd lose the little financial stability she had. Then came the sentence that cut something inside her. "Maybe you should stop with that garage cooking thing. That's not going to take you anywhere." Mariella didn't argue, but when she stepped out of that suffocating office, something shifted inside her. It felt like an invisible door had closed and another, bigger one, was opening, even if she couldn't quite see its outline yet. That night, while packing meal boxes in the garage, Francis rushed in holding an envelope. "Mari, you need to see this." Inside was a letter of approval from a city program that supports small immigrant businesses. She had applied months earlier, on a night filled with boredom and hope, filling out an online form with the broken English she'd learned at the restaurant. She barely remembered doing it. But there it was. She'd been approved for a $5,000 microloan. Mariella covered her mouth, trying not to cry. $5,000 was more money than she had saved in her entire life. It was a real door. A tangible one, a legitimate chance to turn her dream into something bigger than a cramped garage. "This is a sign," Francis said, gripping her shoulders. "A big one." "But what about my job?" Mariella whispered, torn between fear and excitement. "Who said you still need to stay there?" Francis replied, "You already have your path." That night, Mariella walked alone to the beach, letting the warm wind hit her face. The ocean seemed to breathe with her. She thought about her mother, about the life she left behind, about all the nights she thought she wouldn't make it. She thought about her manager's words, so small compared to the size of her dream. By sunrise, she'd made her decision. Se quit. There was no more space in her heart for choosing safety over courage. The days that followed were transformative. She used the microloan to rent an old, rusted, beat-up food truck barely holding together, but still functional. She painted the sides with the colors of the Bolivian flag. She added the name she'd always whispered to herself in secret, Sabores de Mariela. The food truck, imperfect as it was, seemed to shine under the Miami sun like a sign of what was coming. The first night of service was chaos. The stove jammed, the freezer crashed, the lines never ended. But in the middle of all that mess, something incredible was happening. Customers walked away smiling, emotional, saying the food had soul, that it had history, that it tasted like mom. Mariella served each plate with hands that no longer trembled. She was tired. Yes, but it was a different kind of tired. The kind that warms you, fuels you, gives your life meaning. On the third week of operation, a local food critic showed up unannounced. She had no idea who he was. She served him with her usual shy smile. Ate slowly, closing his eyes between each bite. When he finished, he thanked her with a soft nod and left. Days later, he published a review titled, "The Woman Who Cooks Stories, the Food Truck You Need to Visit Before It Gets Too Famous." That title changed everything. Lines wrapped around the block. Influencers came. Tourists followed the address from social media. And Mariella, for the first time in her life, allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was reaching a future she had never dared to dream. But there was still one last leap ahead. The biggest of all. And it was closer than she thought. The unexpected success of the food truck turned Mariella's routine into something she never could imagined back when she arrived in the US with $500 hidden in her socks and a heart shattered in her chest. The days were long, almost endless, but now filled with a kind of exhaustion that came wrapped in pride. Lines curling around the block, tourists taking photos, influencers filming videos, immigrants thanking her for giving them a flavor that reconnected them to their own roots. It was like every spoonful was a hug, and every plate served was a small victory against everything that once made her believe she was invisible. But with the sudden surge in demand came new pressures. The truck had its limits. Some days the equipment failed, the ingredients ran out, and the heat inside the truck turned every minute into a test of endurance. And then there was the question everyone kept asking, the one Mariella avoided even thinking about. "So, when are you opening your own restaurant?" She always answered with a shy smile, looking away, saying it wasn't time yet. But deep down, a quiet fear lived inside her. Opening a restaurant meant exposing everything. It meant admitting there was an expectation now, a responsibility, a dream far too big for a woman who'd spent her whole life being taught to dream small. Yet, little by little, life began pushing her exactly in that direction. One afternoon, while organizing ingredients inside the food truck, Mariella received an unexpected visit from a pair of investors. A gray-haired American man and an elegant Colombian woman, both smiling, both carrying that confident air of people who can spot talent long before the person sees it in themselves. They introduced themselves, praised her food, explained they'd been following her story in the local media. And then, direct yet gentle, they made their proposal. They wanted to fund a brick-and-mortar restaurant. They wanted to help turn Sabres de Mariella into something much bigger. Mariella froze. Her first reaction wasn't enjoy, it was panic. I don't know how to run a restaurant," she admitted, her voice unsteady. The Colombian woman smiled warmly, the way someone who's carried fear on their own back knows exactly how it feels. "You'll learn," she said simply. Everyone who started big once started far too small. They left their business cards, asking her to take her time and think. But from that day on, the idea fluttered inside her like a trapped bird, desire and fear crashing into each other in silence. And, as always, in her life, the answer didn't come from pride, it came from her heart. One summer night, after closing the food truck, Mariella went to the beach, the same place where months earlier, she'd decided to quit the restaurant that diminished her. The ocean was calm, reflecting the moon like a cracked mirror. She sat on the warm sand, pulled out the old photo of her mother, and stared at the face that had guided her even after becoming only memory. "Mama," she whispered, feeling the warm breeze touch her face. "What if I'm not capable? What if I fail?" The silence of the beach answered the same way it always did, without words, but with a deep certainty. Her mother hadn't left written recipes, only histories. No fortune, only strength. No instructions, only love. And that love was what she carried in her hands every time she cooked. When she returned home that night, the decision was already made. The next day, she called the investors. Her voice trembled, but her soul stood firm. "I accept. Let's open the restaurant." The process was slow, exhausting, and full of bureaucratic hurdles she never imagined she'd face. Signing documents in an English that still stumbled in her mouth. Choosing a location, approving renovations, testing menus, training employees, everything was new. Sometimes fear came back hard, especially when she saw numbers too big or machines broke down without warning. But for the first time, she didn't feel alone. An entire community stood beside her. Frances helped with everything she could. The Haitian delivery man kept working, now with an improvised badge. Even old customers came by to volunteer, painting walls, installing shelves, doing whatever needed to be done. 6 months later, when Sabres de Mariella Brickell finally opened its doors, the restaurant was small, but nothing about the feeling inside that space was small. The walls were decorated with old Bolivian photos, including a large image of her mother cooking over a wood stove. There were hanging plants, warm lights, soft music. It felt like she had transported a piece of her story into that room. Opening night was an event. The lines were long, the laughter loud, the reactions emotional. People cried tasting dishes that reminded them of childhoods in faraway places. Couples shared bites, Families snapped photos. Tourists marveled at the colors and aromas. Mariella walked between the tables in a daze, somewhere between disbelief and pride. It didn't feel real. It didn't feel possible. It only sank in when a customer approached her, a Bolivian man with kind eyes, maybe in his 50s. "You're honoring your country," he said, holding her hand gently. "Your mother would be very proud." Mariella tried to answer, but her voice broke. Tears rose warm, soft, freeing. "Gracias," she whispered, "for everything." That night, after the restaurant closed, she sat alone for a few moments in the silent dining room. The warm light reflected on the frames, and the kitchen still carried a soft perfume of spices. She sat at an empty table, opened her backpack, and pulled out the photos of her mother once more. And there, in a space that was now truly hers, she finally let herself cry, not from pain, not from exhaustion, but from triumph. She thought of the girl who washed dishes invisibly in a chaotic kitchen. She thought of the woman who cooked in a moldy garage with more dreams than ingredients. She thought of the immigrant who arrived in the United States with only $500 and a heart too broken to believe in anything. And now, here she was. A restaurant owner, a businesswoman, a community figure, a millionaire, not overnight, not by miracle, but by every tear, every sleepless night, every sacrifice. The final scene of her journey unfolds when Mariella turns off the lights, locks the glass door, and, before walking away, looks up at the glowing sign shining on the brickle sidewalk, Sabores de Mariela. It wasn't just a business, it was her story, her life, the most beautiful part of herself, transformed into a future. She smiles, a smile full of scars, but also full of light. A smile of someone who finally understands that being a millionaire wasn't about the money, it was about who she had to become to get there. And then she walks into the warm Miami night, lighter than she's ever been, knowing that the woman who entered this country with a broken heart now walks with a whole one rebuilt, plate by plate, dream by dream. Te.